Some truths don't hide in shadows. They sit quietly in sunlight, behind lace curtains and polite smiles, waiting for someone curious enough to notice the tremor in a teacup, or the silence after a name is spoken. In a village where nothing ever happens, the deadliest secrets are the ones that were never meant to be discovered. And once a whisper escapes, it changes everything. It was nearing 10 when a sound, so faint and brittle it might have been mistaken for the creak of timber, touched the old wooden door of the Grafin Hollow rectory. A timid knock, half-hearted and almost apologetic, as if even it feared to disturb the peace that blanketed the village under a pale, watchful moon. Reverend Elias Thorncroft, a man of quiet convictions and a mind disciplined by decades of confessions, prayer and long silences, had just extinguished the last of his study candles. The flame sizzled into nothing as if forewarning what was about to arrive. Wrapped in his night robe and holding a well-worn leather-bound book of Psalms, he approached the door with slow, measured steps. There stood Mrs. Lenora Hemsley, a figure so diminished by time and solitude that she seemed sculpted from shadows and shawls, her eyes rimmed with a weariness that no sleep could cure. She hadn't stepped beyond her threshold in months, her days governed by repetition, her world contained within the creaking walls of her ivy-draped cottage. Yet now she stood before him, bone-thin, pale as driftwood, trembling as though the night had bled into her veins. Without a word he stepped aside. She entered with the hesitant grace of someone who had rehearsed this moment many times in private, but found her resolve dissolving in the presence of light. He offered tea, she refused. He gestured to the fireplace, she sat instead in the stiff straight-backed chair near the window, where the wind hissed faintly through the cracks. Then, without preamble, her voice broke the stillness, brittle, hoarse and strange in the way truth sounds when it has been buried too long. "There's a lie," she whispered, fingers twisting the edge of her shawl, a lie that was folded and hidden like a letter no one dared to open. Her eyes met his then, not pleading but tired of carrying the weight alone. And a man who died with that lie in his mouth. Reverend Thorncroft did not flinch, though a flicker of something passed across his face when she uttered the name, Alaric Dawn, a name that had once set tongues wagging and constables pacing. The Summerfield theft, silver heirlooms vanished, suspicions cast like stones and a man accused without protest. Lenora spoke in fragments, her voice like a rusted wind chime, a stormy night, a cellar door left ajar, the glint of a pocket watch beneath moonlight, a scream muffled in linen, and hands that trembled, not from guilt but from what they had witnessed. She spoke of a pact, formed between 3 souls, stitched together by fear and silence, one of whom was already dust in the churchyard. The Reverend scribbled down her words with a shaking hand onto the back of an old baptismal registry, his own pulse echoing like distant thunder. When he rose to accompany her home, she declined gently, saying only, "Some things walk home on their own, Reverend, and some never truly leave." And with that she stepped into the fog, swallowed whole by the night. By dawn the village creaked into motion, bakery deliveries, clanging milk cans and the slow chime of chapel bells. But one cottage remained silent, curtains drawn, cat restless inside, and the post still in its box. It was Mrs. Delphine Rook, her neighbour and the village's most attentive gossip, who raised the alarm. By midday the constable forced open the door. Inside, Mrs. Hemsley lay as though in prayer, hands folded neatly, her bedclothes undisturbed, her face oddly peaceful. But it wasn't the serenity that unsettled the constable. It was the open drawer with the rusted lock broken, the faint scent of lavender oil masking something metallic, and a photograph half burnt in the hearth. Dr. Felix Marin arrived from the next town over, and declared it natural. Age, exhaustion, the body finally giving in, but Evelyn Clay, her former housemaid, later whispered to the Reverend that the teacup by her bed was uncharacteristically dark in colour, that the rug in the front hall was askew, precisely 4 inches to the left, and that Mrs. Hemsley had always been fanatically precise. "Something's wrong," she said, and I think she knew it would be. The funeral was swift, modest, forgettable, but Reverend Thorncroft could not forget. The crumpled sheet with her last words burned a hole in his conscience. Why had she come? Why now? Why only part of the truth? And why in the hours after her death had 2 unknown men visited the chapel grounds, speaking in low tones, looking not at the altar but at the floorboards beneath it? That evening, as the fog thickened once again and the village resumed its slumber, a figure stepped off the 4:15 train. Miss Celestine Greaves, a retired librarian known for her obsession with unsolved histories, had arrived, a journal tucked under her arm and a strange glint in her eye. When she passed the Hemsley cottage, she paused. The air around it felt different. Still, watching, "Some doors," she whispered, "don't creak when they open, they wait." What unsettled Miss Calder most was not the death itself. Death visited all villages eventually, but the way in which this particular village, so meticulously polite and well practiced in grief, had responded to it. There was a curious eagerness to smooth over the event, as though it were a smudge on the silverware before afternoon tea, inconvenient but best ignored. No hush of scandal, no ripple of inquiry, only a sequence of gentle nods, half-hearted condolences, and a premature return to normalcy. The widow Esther Trevelyan had lived quietly, yes, but not invisibly, and yet her passing had provoked no reminiscence, no whispered recollections, not even from Agnes Hartley, who fancied herself the village's historian. At tea with the rector's wife and Mrs. Langley, the subject had floated up politely between sips of Darjeeling and remarks about the weather. "Poor Esther," someone muttered, eyes averted, and then it was gone, buried beneath idle talk of begonias and choir practice. That, to Miss Calder, was telling. Real grief lingered, real shock interrupted. This was something else, and as she walked through the old churchyard that evening, her footsteps crunching softly on the gravel path, she paused before Esther's grave. The earth was too firm, the daisies too artificial, the marble plaque too clean, as though the burial had been planned ahead of time, rehearsed even, like a stage prop in a village play. The scent of fresh varnish still clung to the carved name, and there was no sign of rain having disturbed the soil, though clouds had wept heavily the night before. Her eyes drifted to the nearby trees, but what caught her attention was subtler, a flutter of movement near the cottage at the edge of the churchyard, Trevelyan's house. Its shutters were tightly drawn, yet the bell above the doorframe moved ever so slightly, as if someone had passed through moments earlier. No wind, no visible presence, and still, that soft metallic sway. The garden gate had been left ajar, and beside it, on the cracked stone path, lay a single tulip petal, bruised, deep red, and unmistakably out of season. A trivial thing, perhaps. But Miss Calder, after decades of reading human nature like faded old novels, knew that truth often disguised itself in the trivial. A petal, a misplaced letter, a too swift funeral. These were the murmurs beneath the silence. Back at the rectory, Reverend Hale stood stiffly before the hearth, turning a torn page over in his fingers. It had arrived 2 nights prior, unsigned, stuffed anonymously beneath the vestry door, smelling faintly of mildew and garden soil. Its words were fragmented, frantic. Clara Montford. She knew, not natural. The room behind the pantry, key was missing again. Ask the boy. Hale had read it a dozen times, hoping it would make less sense each time. But it didn't. There were names, implied wrongs, a suggestion of misdiagnosis, no, something worse. And the final line, half smudged but legible, "Tell her before someone else does." He'd told himself it was nothing. An old woman's rambling diary page, perhaps, until he opened the worn family Bible and a photograph slipped out. It hadn't been there the previous night, black and white, slightly water-damaged. A woman in mourning lace, not Esther, but standing beside her, and a young man in a gardener's apron, face half-turned, avoiding the lens. On the back, 2 sets of handwriting, Clara Montford, 1947, and below it, in a darker ink, "He knows." That night, Hale sat long into the firelight, the paper curling to ash in the grate, but the photograph clutched tightly in his hand. Something that should have ended 30 years ago had stirred again, faint but insistent, like a whisper through a closed window. Meanwhile, the villagers moved with a well-rehearsed grace, as if dancing around a wound they'd long forgotten how to treat. Lydia Trevelyan, Esther's cousin, recently arrived from Norwich under vague pretenses, seemed constantly distracted, always fiddling with a brooch at her collar or glancing toward the town well as though expecting it to speak. The doctor, Elias Warren, offered calm reassurances to all who asked, but his own eyes betrayed the fatigue of someone who had convinced everyone except himself. And Evelyn, the housekeeper, moved like a ghost in a house that had not yet accepted its haunting. Everyone was quiet, too quiet. And Miss Calder, tea left unfinished in her cup, watched it all, not with suspicion, but with the kind of patience born only from knowing that some questions, once asked, do not go quietly back into the dark. The odd thing wasn't that Eleanor Whitcomb had passed away at 91 with her bones grown bird-light and her mind fogged like the morning mist over the Ashfield Hollow moor, but that the village responded to her death with a curious blend of relief and restraint, like mourners at a play whose ending they had rehearsed too many times. People spoke softly, but not sorrowfully. Faces wore somberness like borrowed coats, presentable but ill-fitting. There was no weeping at the reading of the will, only a taut silence when Clarissa Dane, Eleanor's long-estranged niece, was mentioned briefly and then omitted entirely. That Clarissa had returned only recently, answering a summons she claimed was handwritten by Eleanor, was strange enough. Stranger still was the sudden appearance of Julian Armitage, a dapper solicitor from London, young enough to raise eyebrows with documents so neatly prepared they seemed anticipatory. His voice was polished, but his pauses told stories, like when Mrs. Halcombe asked almost playfully if he had ever met Eleanor in person, and a flicker too long passed before his answer. 3 days later, the annual village fete resumed as if nothing had occurred, bunting strung over Eleanor's south lawn and lemon tarts arranged with precision. But underneath the clinking of teacups and rehearsed laughter was something brittle, a tension too quiet to be called gossip, but far too loud to be ignored. It was in the gentle murmur of names half-whispered that Miss Thora Beckett, a quietly formidable former librarian with a habit of asking questions nobody thought to ask, first heard the name Clifford Rowe. Agnes Blythe, while dusting icing sugar over scones, mentioned him as if invoking a ghost she wasn't sure she believed in anymore. "You remember," she said casually, "that time in '87 when Eleanor's opal pendant went missing?" She said Clifford took it. Gardener's son, polite boy, barely spoke, and then, poof, gone like fog. No charges, no search, no apology, just silence wrapped like ivy around a grave. Miss Beckett remembered Clifford too, how he once brought her anemones in spring, how his mother left town weeks after his disappearance, how Eleanor had resumed life as if his name had never been spoken. That afternoon, Thora observed the fete, not with delight but scrutiny. She noticed how Greta Hill, Eleanor's closest companion, stood apart from the crowd, eyes fixed on the distant church tower as though searching for absolution, and at exactly 4 o'clock, when the bells of St. Timothy rang, a gentle chime most barely noticed, Greta stiffened, not dramatically, but deeply, like a woman struck by a sound too heavy for her memory to bear. Meanwhile, Lydia Hartwell, Eleanor's distant cousin, fresh from London and suddenly present after years of silence, flitted from guest to guest like a butterfly unwilling to land. Her posture was perfect, her hair immaculately set, but her eyes scanned every corner of the manor grounds, like someone looking not at scenery, but for escape routes. Thora noted how Lydia never entered the west corridor, where Eleanor's private study had once been, and how she once, in the span of 15 minutes, gave 2 separate answers about where she'd spent the morning. That evening, as the last chairs were folded and the final macarons packed away, Thora strolled past the garden shed, a space supposedly locked, and found the door ajar. Inside, beneath layers of dust and garden tarps, was a faded shoebox. In it, a bundle of yellowed letters addressed in a looping, uncertain hand to Miss E.W., signed simply, C.R., and tucked within them, wrapped in tissue paper that had long since yellowed, was a brooch shaped like a raven's wing, dull but unmistakably real. The letters were dated between 1983 and 1987 years Eleanor never spoke of, and they grew darker in tone, shifting from affection to desperation to something that read like a last goodbye. One letter ended abruptly, mid-sentence, with ink smeared as if by a tear, or something wetter. That night, Thora lit a single candle in her sitting room and began reading, her fingers trembling not from age but recognition. The story the village believed, the theft, the disappearance, the silence, wasn't just incomplete, it was false. Clifford hadn't vanished. He had been buried, not in earth but in memory, intentionally, and someone in Ashfield Hollow knew. Someone had rewritten the past with ink so thick they had trusted it would never fade. But now, Eleanor was dead, and with her passing, the seal had broken, the brooch was back, the letters had resurfaced, and secrets, no matter how deeply buried, have a way of finding air. Outside, the church bells rang again, distant but steady, and this time, Miss Beckett wasn't the only one listening. No one in Darnley Hollow could remember placing the lilies on the Wetherham grave, yet there they were, impossibly fresh, ivory-white blooms resting against cold grey stone on a morning, thick with coastal fog, their dew-heavy petals trembling as though they carried grief not of this world, but of memory itself. The grave, untouched for nearly 3 decades, belonged to no one. The newer villagers spoke of openly, its inscription weather-worn, the name obscured except for a single lingering initial, T.W. Old Murray, the groundskeeper with a limp from the war and cataracts in both eyes, swore under his breath that no one had crossed the gates for days, yet he looked away when asked again, fiddling with his rusted keys as though they might unlock something long buried in his conscience. Miss Cressida Vale, who had once been a Wetherham herself before a hasty marriage and a quiet return, noticed the lilies first on her morning walk to the chapel, and while she did not pause for long, her fingers gripped her leather-bound prayer book so tightly the spine cracked. She said nothing to the vicar, nor to the elderly widow pruning her roses at the fence, but her steps faltered as she passed the cemetery wall, and by dusk the candle in her window burned far longer than usual, a flickering sentinel in a village that preferred its shadows undisturbed. That very evening beneath a thunder-stained sky, young Elliot Carow, a boy with a habit of wandering too far and returning with questions no one liked to answer, discovered an envelope wedged beneath the pew cushions inside St. Anselm's chapel. The envelope was unmarked and damp, its seal already broken, and within it lay a single torn scrap of parchment bearing 5 simple words inked in the delicate hand of someone practiced in writing secrets. He remembers what they forgot. No explanation, no signature, no date, just the message, trembling on aged paper like a breath held too long. When Elliot told his grandmother, she made him burn it without reading it aloud again. The next morning, Cressida Vale did not attend service, nor did she answer her door when the vicar called with fresh bread. Her cousin Eleanor, ever the meddler, let herself in through the side door and found the sitting room curiously altered. The fireplace roared despite the summer heat, the curtains drawn tightly shut against the day, and every mirror in the house, 3 of them she counted, covered with sheets of black lace that hadn't been touched since the morning years of 1943. A dusty bottle of sherry lay uncorked on the sideboard, beside a letter opener stained faintly at the edge. On the writing desk, once immaculately arranged, sat an overturned photograph, its cracked frame revealing the faint impression of 4 smiling figures at a summer picnic, the face of the man at the center scraped out with the blunt edge of a blade. Eleanor said nothing aloud, but her glance lingered on the photograph a second too long. That night, the bell in the chapel tower rang 13 times, though the village clock struck only midnight, and the sound was wrong, not just in number but in weight. It echoed as if rung from underwater, deep and distorted like something ancient calling out from beneath. By dawn, the village postmistress found an envelope resting in her outgoing tray, addressed in slanted old-world cursive to a name not seen since the fire at Grey Hollow House, Thomas Eddington. There was no sender listed, and though she asked no questions, the tremor in her hand betrayed a recognition she would never admit. That same day, Reverend Finch, while preparing for his afternoon sermon, noticed a pale smudge on the altar rail, a faint powdery impression of a small child's hand. He wiped it with his sleeve and said nothing, but that evening he refused his usual glass of port and locked the communion wine inside the cellar without explanation. The children in the village began murmuring about seeing a figure in black by the pond, a woman with her back turned and her reflection missing from the water. And though no one could confirm it, some swore they heard quiet singing like a lullaby in a forgotten tongue, drifting through the hedgerows at dusk. Meanwhile, Cressida was last seen walking along the edge of St. Anselm's Pond, her nightgown soaked at the hem, staring into the still water as though awaiting a reply. The pond hadn't been dredged since the war, and what lay beneath had long been presumed lost to time. But now, as the lilies on the grave began to wither and the veil of silence began to lift, the past carefully buried, elegantly ignored was beginning to stir. Not in the violent clatter of vengeance, but in the slow, deliberate unfolding of truth. The kind of truth that returns with the scent of lilies and the sound of bells rung one time too many. The kind that waits, patient and unspoken, until someone dares to look backward and ask what was never meant to be remembered. The porcelain cup rested alone on the low table beside the armchair, neither misplaced nor forgotten, but set down with the kind of careful precision that speaks not of comfort, but of intent, its dainty shape catching the last thread of afternoon light like a silent signal in a house too full of shadows. Miss Lillian Gray didn't reach for it, nor did she comment, but her eyes paused there for just a beat longer than necessary. She had seen such cups before, not this exact one of course, but ones like it, the kind chosen deliberately, their quiet presence meant to pass unnoticed, except by those trained to notice. It was not part of the household set, that much was obvious. The vine of dusky nightshade curling delicately along its lip didn't match the cornflower-trimmed china the rest of the tea service bore, and in a home this meticulous, mismatches were never accidents. Mrs. Hallcroft, dignified and distant in a mourning shawl that still held the faintest scent of mothballs and old soap, followed Lillian's gaze with the stiffness of someone whose nerves were wound too tight, and within seconds she'd whisked the cup away with a hollow laugh and some vague remark about the maid's forgetfulness, yet her hands trembled ever so slightly, and when she turned away, Lillian caught the tiniest whisper of guilt ghosting across her expression, quickly smothered. The room was silent again, thick with the kind of quiet that comes not from peace but from repression, and Lillian let it settle, let the stillness press in around her until it yielded to the faintest creaks and sighs of old wood and older memories. Later, when the housekeeper's unexpected errand left her alone longer than courtesy would normally allow, she wandered not aimlessly but gently, quietly, her eyes sweeping across the worn bookshelves built into the wall like ribs, each volume slotted with the kind of habitual placement only decades of repetition can bring. But there on the second shelf from the bottom something was wrong. A single book, the concise guide to English topiary, had been inserted backwards, its spine to the wall, a strange and silent reversal in a house obsessed with outward appearances. Lillian reached out with slow fingers, easing it free, and behind it, tucked neatly into a shallow cavity carved out long ago, lay a bundle of items tied with age-darkened twine. Photographs with sepia edges curled like old petals, a brittle scrapbook filled with pressed flowers, and the initials EP carved in childish loops, and a page torn roughly from a diary, its lines faint but unmistakably penned in a rushed, shaking hand. She didn't need to read it all, only the last line caught her breath. He knows, but he won't speak. She stared for a long moment, the words echoing in the back of her mind like a voice from underwater, and though she returned everything exactly as she'd found it, she adjusted the topiary book so its spine faced outward once more, realigning the facade. She didn't speak of what she'd seen, not even when Mrs. Hallcroft returned with a careful smile and eyes that avoided hers. But inwardly, Lillian was no longer just a visitor, she was a witness. And this house, so determined to be still and silent, had begun to stir beneath its layers. Edward Penrose, the name had been whispered before, hadn't it? Murmured by a dying woman in some long-ago storm. The boy, the lake, don't let him back in the house. The initials matched. The scrapbook. The scratched-out photo of a child whose face had been erased by grief or guilt. And there, beneath her quiet calm, Lillian's thoughts raced, not with fear, but with grim clarity. This house hadn't forgotten. It had buried, had stitched up every loose end and locked it behind routine, behind teacups and stiff conversations, and rooms that hadn't been entered since the West Wing was closed. But a house cannot contain pain forever. It seeps through floorboards and picture frames, through faint stains no scrubbing can quite remove. And now, with one misplaced cup and a single page of trembling handwriting, something had shifted. The silence here was not passive, it was curated, built into the bones of the home like insulation, but cracks had begun to show. And Lillian Gray, with her unassuming smile and quiet steps, knew better than anyone, once silence is broken, the truth, no matter how deeply hidden, starts to whisper again. No rain had fallen that day, yet the village of Darrenton wore the mood of a storm long past, as though something had cracked the very air, and left behind only the echo. When Miss Edeline Voss arrived at the weather-beaten threshold of Darrenton House, the crunch of gravel beneath her boots felt far louder than it ought to have been, like an unwanted knock on a locked memory. She was greeted not with words but with a measured nod from the housekeeper, a woman with parchment skin and a gaze like frosted glass, who led her into the drawing-room without ceremony. The air inside clung close, perfumed faintly with wilted rose and coal ash, and the silence was such that even the mantel clock ticked as though in mourning. Lady Bramhall, seated stiffly in a high-backed chair upholstered in tired brocade, greeted Edeline with a voice brittle as porcelain. "You've come a long way for a name carved in stone," she said, her fingers tightening around a carved ivory cane. "The past prefers to be left buried, Miss Voss. Too many hands have tried to unearth it." But Edeline was no stranger to buried things. She had spent 16 years chasing echoes, assembling fragments of a story no one would admit had ever begun. Her eyes, steady and grey as sea fog, roamed the room, not rudely but carefully, pausing on the slightly misaligned frame of a portrait, the faint water stain on the wainscoting, the half-burned candle that had melted unevenly, betraying a draught where none should be. When Lady Bramhall excused herself under the pretext of a headache, Edeline stood and walked the room in slow circles, her gloved fingers trailing along shelves stacked with forgotten books and a piano covered in dust that had settled too evenly. The harmonium in the alcove creaked when opened, revealing a folded note jammed hastily beneath faded sheet music. "Check the bell tower before they silence that too." The writing was shaky, desperate, the kind produced in haste, perhaps fear. She took it with her. At twilight she climbed the bell tower of the long-abandoned St. Luke's Church, the air cold and damp as though the stones remembered a scream they'd never released. The spiral staircase moaned underfoot, and at the top she found a velvet pouch stashed behind a cracked wooden beam. Inside it lay a brooch smeared with dried blood, a child's ribbon, and one half of a broken locket, the other half Edeline had kept all these years, a locket belonging to her sister Rosamond, who had vanished without trace on the eve of her 17th birthday. Edeline did not cry, her tears had long ago dried into determination. She descended in silence and returned to the village inn, where the fire burned too high, and the innkeeper's eyes flickered nervously toward the grandfather clock every time it chimed, as if waiting for something or someone. By morning, news had already reached the square. Thomas Gley, the Bramhalls' aging groundskeeper, had been found slumped against the sundial in the garden, his face contorted not in pain but in surprise. No bruises, no struggle, just an empty cordial bottle beside him, and one boot missing from his left foot. Edeline, unshaken, noted what others dismissed: a pattern, always too clean, always one item removed, always the illusion of accident. Back in her room, she laid out her findings like pieces of a puzzle: the note, the brooch, the locket, the inn's guestbook page from 16 years ago, where someone had checked in under the name R. Bralden, a name too conveniently close to Rosamond Bramhall, a name no one had connected, or dared to. Her eyes narrowed. It was not just a cover-up, it was a ritual, a method of erasing someone not just from life but from memory. That evening she returned once more to Darrenton House, where shadows loomed thicker and silence deeper, and where the portraits on the wall seemed to watch her every move. In the study she found the final piece, a journal bound in red leather, belonging to the late Lord Bramhall, its pages torn out toward the end, save for one entry that read, "She found the truth in the bell tower, it must not leave with her." Beneath it, scrawled in shaking ink, "Bury the locket, Burn the note, break the sister. Edeline closed the journal gently, her breath slow, her resolve colder than ever. It wasn't just Rosamond they'd silenced, it was every whisper of dissent, every question unasked. But now, finally, someone had dared to ask again, and this time the house would answer. Colonel Elbridge was never a man prone to embellishments. His life ticked forward like the second hand of an old watch, straight, punctual, and untouched by idle speculation. But that morning, when he saw Miss Harrow seated quietly on the narrow bench behind the chapel, there was something in his eyes, a reluctance, almost shame, that only those who know their words carry weight and danger possess. Miss Harrow listened the way one listens to the return of a long-forgotten pain, head slightly bowed, pauses drawn out, her gaze more attuned to what was felt than what was said. Colonel stated plainly that he had seen Mr. Darnell at precisely 5:15 p.m., walking along the chapel path, not hurried, but with unmistakable purpose. Yet Darnell's body had been found elsewhere, and the watch in his pocket had stopped at 4:03 p.m., not broken, not water-damaged, but silenced by someone's deliberate hand. Miss Harrow's thoughts clicked into motion. She gently asked whether the colonel had noticed anyone else, any shadow or companion, but he only repeated that Darnell had been moving with a decision already made. Men with purpose, she mused, usually return alive unless someone intervenes. Time no longer aligned with the events of that day, and when time breaks, truth seeps through the cracks, unbidden, uninvited, and rarely kind. Amidst this unsettling realization, Clara Weston revealed a codicil, an amendment to Eleanor Darnell's original will, supposedly written years ago, naming Clara the beneficiary should her brother predecease her. Miss Harrow watched Clara's delivery with the precision of someone studying a staged performance, every word chosen carefully, every breath rehearsed, not with certainty, but with the hope of becoming believable. But the village had whispered otherwise. In post office queues, beneath flour-dusted bakery counters, and around steaming kitchen stoves, stories travelled like ghost drafts of Eleanor's sudden restlessness, her nocturnal scribblings in old diaries, the forgotten names she had begun to speak again. Hannah Blythe, unseen in the Darnell home for over a decade, had been summoned twice. Dr. Crowthorne's carriage had been spotted pulling up at odd hours, though he offered no public diagnosis. Most telling of all was the abrupt appearance of Mr. Tilney, the family solicitor, unannounced, discreet and hastily requested, before the weekend. Alone, Eleanor had insisted. That was no casual review. It was urgency, perhaps a rewrite. And if that rewrite cut Clara out, the motive didn't require imagination. The will vanished, but its absence screamed louder than ink ever could. Miss Harrow stopped listening to voices and began reading the spaces between. Hannah, unwittingly, became the key. She mentioned seeing Darnell near the boathouse, not the garden as Clara had claimed. She recalled the conversation involving keys and safes, though her voice faltered on the word safes, and the pause hung in the air like a noose. A groundskeeper, thought to be hard of hearing, admitted hearing a raised voice, not angry but brittle like grief snapping at the edges. Miss Harrow connected it all. A mismatched glove, a sealed decanter, and the initials etched faintly beneath an old writing desk. Then, with cruel irony, Clara handed her the final clue. While rifling through Darnell's drawer, her solemnity theatrical, almost prayerful, a dried snowdrop petal fluttered from an envelope marked to be opened upon my passing. No one spoke. Only Miss Harrow with quiet interest requested that it be set aside. A snowdrop, the same flower Eleanor placed every year on her brother's breakfast tray, the one tied to childhood winters and shared secrets. The same motif, curiously absent from the saucer collection, now surfaced from the one thing that should have remained untouched. Its emergence didn't speak, it screamed. Someone had tried to burn the truth, but its ashes now danced freely in the air, settling wherever eyes remained open and quiet minds began to see. The room was steeped in that peculiar kind of quiet that did not soothe, but instead coiled in the corners like old secrets refusing to die. It was the quiet of withheld truths, of remorse buried under civility and silence. Miss Elara Gray sat across from Dr. Nathaniel Voss, the village physician once considered a pillar of discretion, but who now looked like a man unraveling beneath the weight of something corrosive and long avoided. No tea was offered, no words of welcome, only a chair pulled slightly toward the streaked window where the last fractured sunlight of autumn pressed against glass like something desperate to get in or out. His hands trembled not with age but with memory as he finally spoke, each word emerging like a reluctant ghost forced from hiding. "I destroyed the letter," he said, his voice flat, cracked with restraint, an admission neither proud nor regretful, but laced with the cold resignation of someone who thought he was doing right until too late to undo the wrong. The letter, he explained, had been found tucked behind a drawer in the vestry cabinet, stuffed inside the crumbling cover of a hymn book from decades ago. It had been scribbled in a dying hand on the back of a prescription slip, the ink smudged in places where tears or perhaps shaking fingers had marred the words. It had read, "They buried her under the wrong name, they called it fever, but I saw his gloves wet still, and the bottle open left on the sill." That single page, half legible and unsigned, had chilled him more than any autopsy ever could. The writer, he believed, had been Marjorie Vale, the woman who vanished under a veil of politeness 20 years ago, her disappearance explained by a single impersonal letter and a suspiciously quick sale of her home to a widow who arrived with too few belongings and too many questions. At the time, everyone accepted it. They had to. Marjorie had always been a little too curious, a little too direct, and in villages like these, women like her had a way of vanishing into explanations others find more convenient than true. But Ilara had come across her name not once, but 3 times this past month, each time whispered with just enough hesitation to confirm that Marjorie's absence had not been forgotten, only buried. And now, with Dr. Voss's confession sitting between them like a slow-burning candle, the picture he handed her fanned the flame. Folded in tissue and hidden behind false receipts in his ledger was a photograph of Marjorie, young, standing beside a faded horse stable, her summer dress creased, her smile uneasy, and just barely visible beneath the collar bruises like ink stains on the throat of someone who had tried to scream but knew better. It was the same expression Ilara had seen in another girl's photograph years earlier. Emily Trevor's, whose cheerful volunteer trip overseas ended with nothing but a sanitized letter and a box of untouched clothing returned to her family. But it wasn't just the bruises or the disappearances, it was the church bell that tied it together. Miss Ilara recalled an old account from a dying groundskeeper who claimed that on a Tuesday long ago when no service was scheduled, the bell had rung 3 times and he had seen a barefoot woman running across the marsh, clutching a shawl soaked in something dark and thick, not water but something heavier. His story had been dismissed as a fever dream, as all inconvenient truths often are, and yet now the edges of these scattered pieces began to sharpen, forming a shape far more disturbing than coincidence. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Halloway, who was known for her joyful rambling and floral hats, had turned pale the moment Ilara mentioned Marjorie's name, her fingers tightening around her teacup until it cracked audibly. She shouldn't have come back, the woman had whispered, barely audibly. He told her it wouldn't be safe. Those 7 words were enough to unearth everything. Marjorie had returned briefly, secretly, weeks before her death. She had visited the church, deposited something in the archives, and disappeared before anyone noticed her scent had returned to the village wind. That something was now missing. The parish register from 1903 to 1914 had been torn from its binding, and a single name within it, linked to an infant never recorded in public, was gone. But it was never the child that mattered, it was the father. The man who had crafted a second life with the calm ease of a surgeon stitching skin over a wound too deep to heal. Ilara realized the killer had never truly left the village. He had simply evolved, wrapped himself in philanthropy, and built a persona so generous, so godly, that no one dared peer too closely. But Marjorie had known. She had been the keeper of too many truths, and perhaps that was why she was erased. Not legally, not violently, just carefully. A whisper at a time, a silence enforced not by fear, but by shame, and now with the photograph folded inside her coat, and the names beginning to align like stars after a long storm, Ilara Gray understood. This was no longer about Marjorie Vale, or Emily Trevor's, or even the bruises that no one had asked about. It was about the architecture of evil, how it hides in plain sight, behind hymns, charity galas, and the smiles of men who hold doors open while locking others shut behind them. Justice, she knew, would not come with sirens or headlines, but quietly, in a whisper passed from one trembling voice to another, in truth surviving not through law, but through the one thing fire could never destroy, memory. They said Renmore Hills Manor was empty, stripped of life, stripped of secrets, but that was a lie people told to keep their conscience from stirring. No secret ever dies in silence, it merely burrows deeper until someone foolish or desperate enough comes digging. That someone was Eleanor Vale, returning after 21 years with no warning, no explanation, and no family left to question her. She didn't claim the crumbling estate her family once ruled with porcelain civility and brutal silence. Instead, she rented the gardener's cottage, paid 6 months' advance in cash, signed the lease as Elaine Vickers, and kept her curtains drawn even when the sky begged for light. No one recognized her after all. The last time they'd seen her, she'd been a glassy-eyed 17-year-old with trembling hands and a mind blotted by laudanum. But someone remembered. A week after she moved in, she received a note. No address, no sender, just a slip of fine vellum slid between her daily bread delivery. "Did you find the gloves?" 5 words. No context. But Eleanor's breath stilled as if time had folded in on itself. The gloves. Of course. Black, stiff with blood. Once worn by Constable Gregory Hartley on the last night he was seen alive. The same night Adrian Vale, her older brother, was questioned by him, and never seen again. That storm-ravaged night in 1904 had become a smudge in village lore. A constable gone missing, a suicide letter found at the cliffs, and a fire that had burned in the Vale fireplace longer and hotter than any before. Officially, Adrian leapt to his death in grief, but Eleanor remembered something different. Whispers in the corridor, a chess piece clenched in Adrian's hand, her mother's scream when she saw the blood, not outside but on the rug beside the cellar door. She had tried to speak, but her words floated like smoke from laudanum-numbed lips, dismissed as hallucinations by Dr. Fenwick, who insisted she was not well. Now in the silence of the cottage, fragments returned to her like broken glass reforming. The clink of gloves dropped into a tin box, the map Adrian once drew with red ink and unspoken warnings, and the phrase he scrawled again and again in the margins of his journal, "Not by fire but by ash." That night, at precisely 3 a.m. when the manor's unwound clock inexplicably chimed, Eleanor crossed the frost-slick lawn and pried open the old cellar door buried beneath moss and memory. The cellar, long thought sealed, breathed dust and cedar. Behind the last wine rack one brick felt loose. Behind it, a rusted tin box waited like it always knew she'd return. Inside, a torn bishop chess piece, a blood-smudged matchbox, and the gloves, still black, still damp, and still marked with the initials GH. Just then, a voice stirred behind her, low, reverent, and unnervingly calm. "I told him to burn them, not to hide them." She turned, heart roaring in her chest, and there stood Father Alden, his face half swallowed by candlelight. He hadn't aged, not really. His eyes still held that unnatural stillness of someone who confesses nothing. In one hand he held a crucifix, in the other, a worn pocketbook bound in cracked leather. "He came to me," he said, "that night. Not because he killed anyone, but because he saw what your mother did when the constable threatened to expose her." Eleanor didn't respond. She stared at the gloves in her hand, gloves that impossibly felt warm as if time had folded back, as if guilt lived in fabric. Father Alden stepped forward and whispered, "Truth doesn't rot, Eleanor. It waits. And it always wants to be seen." In that moment, Eleanor finally understood. Adrian hadn't run. He had hidden the truth to protect her from their mother, from the church, from the past that would not rest. And now that she had returned, the question remained, would she bury it again, or let it burn? The room had the scent of old paper and dried lavender, like a place where memories had been pressed between the pages and forgotten, but never truly gone. The storm had passed, yet the silence it left behind was heavier than thunder, dense with words unsaid and truths long buried. Between the two women, the tray sat like a relic, simple, almost innocent, yet carrying the weight of something unspoken. On it rested the tulip-patterned teacup, its faded colours echoing a history neither wanted to revisit, but both knew they must. Miss Hargrave, upright and composed, watched the steam rise from the untouched cup, as if deciphering an omen. Across from her, Lillian, once the trusted companion, now the reluctant guest, sat with her hands folded too tightly, the knuckles pale beneath their skin. Miss Hargrave began, not with questions but with a name, Joseph, the boy in the silver frame, smiling with the shyness of someone too gentle for the world he had stepped into. Her voice trembled not with emotion, but with restraint, the kind forged over years of silence and self-discipline. Joseph had been fond of the tulip cup, she said. It reminded him of his mother, who had died young and left behind only a scent of bergamot and old letters. Lillian did not speak, but the corner of her lip twitched ever so slightly, the body's betrayal of emotion where words failed. "There's a peculiar cruelty," Miss Hargrave murmured, eyes still on the cup, "in outliving the people whose secrets you carry." And in that silence, something shifted. Not an admission, but the crumble of a dam just before it breaks. Lillian's voice, when it came, was brittle and hushed. "I never meant to return to this house, but I couldn't let her, couldn't let you go unburied beneath a lie. It was not a confession, not yet, but it was the breath before one." Miss Hargrave, who had spent her life listening for the truth between words, waited, letting the stillness settle like snow on an untouched field. Lillian's gaze dropped to the saucer, where her fingers now traced the rim in slow, nervous circles. It wasn't poison. Not really. It was meant to remind her, not kill her. She exhaled the words like smoke, thick with regret. It was a diluted tincture, a drop of belladonna, barely enough to cause a headache. But I misjudged. I didn't know she was so frail. She paused. Or perhaps I did. The tulip cup, she explained, had been chosen with intention, not just for its familiarity, but for its message, its history. It had belonged to Joseph's mother. A cup she had held in happier times, now repurposed to stir old guilt. She would have recognized it, Lillian said. That was the point, to make her remember. But something had gone wrong. Or perhaps, Miss Hargrave thought, something had finally gone right in the worst possible way. "I wanted her to feel conscience," Lillian whispered, "not consequence." There were no tears, only the distant hollowness of someone who had lived too long with the echoes of their own miscalculation. Miss Hargrave remained still, her expression unreadable. "And what of the solicitor?" she asked at last, her tone soft but steely. Mr. Pike, who fell from the study balcony not 3 weeks later. A long silence followed. The air turned colder. He knew, Lillian said eventually, or thought he did. He cornered me outside the chapel, smiled like it was all a game, said the past is just clutter, waiting to be swept aside. Her jaw clenched, and something in me broke. She hadn't planned to follow him into the study, hadn't meant to let the balcony door remain open, hadn't touched him, but hadn't stopped what followed either. He stumbled, she said, but I let him. The words hung heavy between them. Miss Hargrave did not flinch. She had seen many masks fall in her time, but none as quietly as this. Then we are left, she said slowly, with 2 cups, 2 deaths, and 1 house too full of silence. Lillian gave a small, bitter smile. Perhaps, she murmured, the truth didn't kill them. Perhaps it only waited for the right cup to be served. And outside, somewhere beyond the shuttered windows, the wind stirred again, not loud but insistent, as if the house itself had exhaled something it had held in far too long. He had lived his life like a man who never once expected the past to return with teeth. For decades, Foyle had moved through village corridors and tea rooms as a figure of impeccable restraint. A man known for discretion more than decency, for influence rather than warmth. But behind that carefully tended exterior lay decisions. Quiet, chilling decisions that reeked not of evil but of moral indifference so deep it passed almost unnoticed. Evelyn remembered the garden that day as a place suspended between seasons. The last of the autumn leaves clinging to skeletal branches, the stone path glazed with frost, and the air brittle with an anticipation she hadn't understood until his laughter fractured it. She had approached him with the question that had haunted her since childhood, not to accuse but to understand. She wanted to believe there was a reason, a misjudgment perhaps, or some deeper rationale. But when she asked him about the child at the mill pond, about the silence, the lies, the hushed funeral with no name on the ledger, he merely chuckled. Not cruelly, not madly, just dismissively, as though it were all tiresome history, irrelevant to the order of things. That was when something unspoken twisted inside her. Not rage, not even grief. It was recognition of who he was, and what he'd always been. She didn't remember picking up the marble urn, only the feel of its cold, uneven base in her palm, the weight of it, the moment it left her hand, then the water, the impossible stillness that followed, and the echo of his laughter strangled by silence. I didn't mean to, she had whispered to herself later, standing in front of the mirror where Honora's perfume still lingered faintly on the lace curtains. But even she knew the words rang hollow. Miss Dalloway, who had listened without a single note of judgment, merely nodded, for the old woman had seen it long before. The clues were never overt. The drawer that hadn't quite shut, the tulip petal pressed like a relic of regret in the family Bible, the missing child's name returned on a misdelivered parcel, all fragments of a puzzle Miss Dalloway had quietly begun assembling while others busied themselves with gossip and garden parties. The justice that had not been served decades ago had begun to stir beneath the surface like something buried too shallow, and it had finally surfaced, not by law but by inevitability. And still the final confirmation hadn't come from Evelyn's trembling voice, nor from Lydia's conspicuous absence at the burial, nor even from Dr. Gray's oddly timed prescriptions. No, it had come from the vicar's safe. A place no one thought to look except Miss Dalloway, who recalled a comment made in passing during an evening tea. Reverend Lambert's musing about a rarely used locked drawer in the church vault, reserved for sealed parish letters and forgotten legacies. With his hesitant blessing she had quietly requested the key. Beneath the yellowed ledgers and deeds of the dead lay an envelope. Plain, unassuming, sealed. It bore the mark of Foyle's legal firm, dated 2 days before his death. Inside a will, meticulously typed, signed, witnessed. A complete reversal of the original. It left Honora's estate not to her blood relative Lydia, but to Evelyn. No fanfare, no justification save for a short letter attached, written in Foyle's own careful script, citing a reckoning long overdue, and a correction of conscience that could no longer wait. Whether it was guilt or redemption that drove him, no one could say. Perhaps he had always intended for the truth to survive him, to surface only after he was gone and therefore beyond the reach of confrontation. Perhaps he hoped his final act might cleanse the ledger he had spent a lifetime doctoring. But redemption delayed often looks like cowardice. Evelyn never found out. She hadn't opened the safe. Miss Dalloway had, and she alone chose not to deliver the contents with drama, but with quiet stewardship. She read the will, copied the letter by hand and returned it all to its hiding place, where it would remain until needed. Later that week she invited them all to the rectory, not with summons or scandal, but with quiet courtesy, so no one could refuse without guilt. Lydia arrived first, gloves tight around her wrists, her posture strained like someone trying to remember a version of events that no longer held. Dr. Gray followed, his coat still dusted with clinic chalk, avoiding everyone's eyes. Evelyn came last, composed but faintly ghost-like, as if something had hollowed her from the inside. The vicar stood in the background, more sentinel than participant, and Miss Dalloway, seated with her knitting still in her lap, began not with accusations but with clarity. Her tone was soft, not sorrowful but certain, like a weathered gardener pointing out where rot had taken root beneath the blooms. She spoke of things misaligned, a cup not matching the set, a chair moved slightly from its usual place, a stopped watch that should have ticked. She spoke of the boy in the mill pond, of the silences arranged like furniture around his absence, of the legacy stolen and then perhaps too late offered back. No one interrupted, not because they agreed, but because something in them already knew, and as her words braided the past and present into one irrevocable truth, no one wept, no one fled. The room, thick with the ghosts of unsaid things, held only the hush that comes when a circle closes and nothing further need be spoken. Justice, Miss Dalloway believed, was not always loud, but it was always final. It was not the storm that startled them that evening, but the silence that followed it, dense, pulsing, unnatural, as though the house itself had drawn in a breath and refused to let it go. The wind had howled, the windows had trembled, but it was the hush after, the eerie, resonant stillness that crept beneath their skin. Miss Althea Cranwell, a woman of sharp intellect and deeper intuition, sat unmoving in her worn velvet armchair by the fireside, her hands folded neatly around a teacup that had long gone cold. Her eyes, pale and unblinking, moved slowly across the faces gathered before her. None of them spoke. None dared. There was something in her posture, in the quiet weight of her composure, that silenced even the most defiant tongue. "There are truths," she said at last, her voice like silk drawn over stone, "that wait until everyone stops pretending." It wasn't accusation, it was excavation. With that single sentence, the carefully constructed walls of denial that had stood for nearly 3 decades began to buckle. For years, the townsfolk had whispered about the fire at Belwick Orphanage, the tragedy that took 7 children and left behind nothing but scorched foundations and a memorial cross that no one truly visited. It had been called an accident, a lightning strike, a cruel twist of fate. But beneath the murmur of prayer and perfunctory grief, darker questions had festered. Why had only 1 child survived? Why were the names of the dead inconsistently recorded? And why had the Reverend's sermons grown quieter after that night, more restrained, more cautious, as though he feared being heard too clearly? No one had dared to dig further. Not with the Reverend's own son among the dead, not with the mayor's niece Clara Penfield, hailed as the miraculous lone survivor, and later praised for transforming the ruins into a youth charity that brought attention and money back to the town. But the fire hadn't truly died, not in spirit. It had smouldered in shadow, waiting, until now. For weeks, Miss Cranwell had been sorting through the late vicar's effects, papers yellowed by age, marginalia scribbled in sermon books, notes on baptisms and burials, but it was what she found folded between the psalms and the epistles that chilled her, a letter, unmarked, unsigned, but its words were soaked in guilt, and the faintest scent of smoke still clung to its creases. It told of a child in the attic, locked in, hidden away the night the fire began. It told of an argument behind the chapel walls, muffled but unmistakable. And it ended with a line that seemed to echo in every corner of the room. It wasn't meant to be murder. It was meant to be silence. The author, Clara Penfield. The survivor, the benefactor, the heroine of Belwick. She had not spoken aloud in weeks, her health failing rapidly, her mind slipping in and out of clarity. But she had whispered enough, to Althea, to the nurse, to the silence itself. She confessed that she had discovered the Reverend's crimes, how he had been selling the children, erasing their identities, forging adoption records, including her sister Eloise, taken without a word, hidden away in the attic when Clara arrived unannounced to confront him. In her panic, Clara had lit a fire, a warning, she thought, just enough to draw attention, just enough to stop him. But fire does not follow intention. It devours, it disobeys. 7 children died that night, the Reverend among them, and Clara, too stunned, too terrified, too alone, had remained silent, and silence, as she would later whisper in fevered dreams, had louder consequences than any scream. But that was not all. Mr. Thorne, the solicitor, always in the background, always impeccably dressed, meticulously quiet, had been more than an administrator. He had rewritten the orphanage's records, filed payments as building repairs, paid off former caretakers to leave town. He hadn't lit the match, but he had cleared the path for fire. Althea confronted him in the ruins of the old chapel, now strangled by ivy and damp with time. She didn't accuse. She handed him the letter. He read it, laughed, a dry, cruel sound, called it delusion, called Clara a fading mind, and then he stepped back. The floor beneath him, a beam long weathered by rot, gave way. Whether it was fear or fate that made him misstep would never be known. He fell, cracked stone. No scream. Just the sickening finality of flesh meeting earth. Althea hadn't followed, not right away. She sat for a long while, letting the ivy move in the wind, letting the dusk swallow the sky. When she descended, he was already gone. Eyes wide open, mouth parting as though to speak, but only dust remained. She did not confess this with drama. There were no tears, only a slow exhale, as though unburdening a weight carried too long. Guilt, she told the others, now seated in the glow of the firelight, doesn't always shout. Sometimes it waits, it watches, and one day it speaks, in a slip of paper, in a stumble, in a whisper before sleep. None of them moved, because all of them in some small way had known. They had seen the records go missing, heard the survivor's story shift over the years, accepted the charity without asking what it cost. They had spoken of forgiveness without seeking truth. But truth, once unearthed, does not remain still. It shifts, it groans, and it demands to be heard. The final blow came not from Althea, but from Clara herself. A new will, delivered not by Thorn, but by the nurse who had been instructed to hold it until Miss Cranwell asks the question. In it, Clara left everything. Not to the church, not to her name, but to the families of the 7 children. Their names restored, their histories unburied, the silence finally shattered. No punishment was requested, no vengeance named, only reparation. And as the fire cracked again in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on faces now too old for denial, it became clear that no one in that room had been entirely innocent, not of action perhaps, but of silence, and silence, as Althea whispered one final time into the stillness, is sometimes the heaviest sin of all. It wasn't the name in the will that stirred the room into stillness, but the way it was spoken, deliberate, final, like a curtain falling on a stage no one knew had been set. Crane Penrose, a name half remembered, half dreaded, and wholly unanticipated. There was a murmur, quickly silenced, not by command, but by the sharp, unforgiving weight of implication. Lydia's lips parted as if to protest, but nothing emerged. Not shock, not denial, just the quiet collapse of certainty. Deep down she had always suspected that something was amiss in the affection she'd worn like armor, too polished, too performative. Her grief, if it could still be called that, was not for the inheritance lost, but for the righteousness unraveled, the fiction of familial favor shattered in a single sentence. Miss Varell did not gloat. The elderly historian merely straightened the cuff of her sleeve, her gaze moving slowly around the parlor like a scalpel. Redemption, she murmured, rarely arrives dressed for comfort, but it does arrive, usually when we've run out of excuses. The constable moved quietly through the crowd and paused before Evelyn Argyll, whose pale hands rested motionless atop her lap. There was no struggle, no indignation, just a request that her brother's name be properly recorded, and that the portrait in the East Hall remain untouched. Her exit was silent, yet final. The same could not be said for the village, which seemed to exhale, as if held breath had waited years to be released. Miss Varell turned then, her voice quiet but unflinching. "It's not the act that ruins us," she said, but the refusal to admit it was ever ours. A hush fell, deeper than before, for the truths unearthed weren't just about stolen children, falsified papers, or smoldering ledgers. They were about who had looked away. The letters found in the floorboards had made it clear. Clara Penrose had not only survived the asylum fire, but escaped it, hidden in plain sight by the very woman she would one day inherit from. Crane was her daughter, taken from her, renamed, placed into the Penrose household under the illusion of charity. And now, at the end of things, Clara had righted that wrong, not with vengeance, but with vindication. Lydia Braithwaite's departure from Brackenfell came swiftly, discreetly. She left behind a neat envelope at the inn, a modest sum for her unpaid rent, and a handwritten note to Miss Varell. Sometimes the hardest truth is knowing you were never the villain, just never the heroine either. She gave no interviews, made no claims, and as her carriage rattled down the slope of Hollow Lane, she did not look back. Miss Varell watched from the study window, her tea growing cold, her eyes following Lydia's silhouette until it blurred with the mist. In her heart she knew Lydia had not been cruel, only conditioned, raised to expect applause from a stage never meant for her. In the weeks that followed, the Penrose estate began to change. The gardener, once forbidden from letting ivy touch the brick, now let it climb. The ornamental pond, drained each autumn like clockwork, was left to fill. A stray cat took residence in the greenhouse, and in the neglected west garden, the soil cracked open and offered blooms not planted in years, reminders perhaps that truth, like nature, always finds a way through. And so did Crine, once nameless, once hidden, now named, now seen. And sometimes in a town like Brackenfell, that is the greatest act of justice, not punishment but acknowledgement, not revenge but restoration. And as the bells of the distant chapel began to toll in mourning, or perhaps in benediction, Miss Virel whispered to no one in particular, "Some inheritances are not written in wills but in wounds, and the deepest ones don't pass, they return." There was a soft, reluctant sunlight creeping through the ivy-laced windows of Elowin Grange that morning. An ancient estate so heavy with silence, it felt like even the walls were holding their breath. For years the village had regarded it with cautious distance, the sort of house that bore secrets too old for whispering, and grief too tired to weep. Locals said Lady Audra Blackwell had died in a tragic accident, tumbled down the narrow staircase late one stormy night, but others, those who noticed the bruises that didn't match the fall, never spoke a word. It was Miss Thorne, a recently retired schoolmistress with sharp eyes and a mind trained on patterns, who arrived with only a small suitcase and a quiet determination to escape her own ghosts. But Elowin Grange, as it turned out, wasn't a place one escaped to. It was where buried things rose. Her first warning came in the form of a worn leather diary she found tucked behind a loose hearthbrick, containing only a single line in spidery handwriting. She saw too much to be allowed to live. Miss Thorne brushed it off as melodramatic nonsense, the relic of an old imagination. Yet at night, books fell from shelves with no breeze. The same candle extinguished at precisely 2:14 a.m., and from the end of the hallway faint humming childlike broken drifted into her dreams. The garden, once a tangle of death, began to bloom again, but not with roses or daffodils. Instead, black trumpet-like flowers emerged, unrecorded in any flora manual, petals like folded ink, appearing exactly where no seeds had been. Then there was the locked door in the east wing, bolted from the inside, its iron hinges stained as though someone had tried desperately to claw their way out. When 17-year-old Maisie Harrow vanished without explanation, her disappearance brushed off as a teenage elopement, Miss Thorne found something beneath the floorboards of the library, a piece of fabric, a charm bracelet engraved with MH, and beside it, a child's drawing pinned with a rusted hairpin. The picture showed 3 women, one with her eyes crossed out. The local constable dismissed it all. No proof, just stories. But Miss Thorne, unbothered, muttered, "Stories are where truths survive." It wasn't long before she discovered the hidden stairwell behind the servants' pantry, narrow and cold, leading to a secret chamber where a single rocking chair sat chained to the floor, and the walls bore crimson scrawls. She remembered, "I told you, and they'll silence me too." A draft shifted the room, and the diary, long since closed, fell open to a new page never written by her hand. Maisie spoke. Audra listened. And then it ended. Miss Thorne knew then, Maisie was not gone. She was stolen, silenced. The truth, heavy and pulsing, had lingered too long in Elowin's bones. Beneath the garden's strange blooms, she dug with trembling fingers and uncovered a buried tin box, inside a faded lock of hair, a blood-stained handkerchief, and a final letter signed by Audra Blackwell. "Forgive me. She was my daughter." The rest of the tale unfolded like a slow storm. Maisie had been Audra's illegitimate child, raised in secret, hidden in plain sight as a housemaid. When the truth began to spill, someone, perhaps Audra herself, perhaps not, chose silence over shame. Miss Thorne handed the letter to the authorities, but no charges were ever filed. No body was ever found. Elowin Grange stood unchanged, cold, proud, and untouched by justice. Miss Thorne left quietly one dawn, never to return. Yet every year on the anniversary of Maisie's disappearance, someone leaves a single white rose at the garden gate. And the trumpet flowers, they never bloomed again. In the village, people speak even more softly now, as though fearing their words might wake something sleeping. Because sometimes evil doesn't announce itself with blood or screams, it waits, patiently, in rocking chairs, in hushes between candle flickers, in the decisions people make to look away. The Grange is still there, a shadow among trees, and its windows seem to watch, because memory, as Miss Thorne once said, doesn't die when people do. It waits. It waits for someone brave enough to listen. And now we leave you with a question that may echo long after the final word fades. If you had uncovered what Lena discovered, if you were the only one who knew the truth behind a smiling facade, would you speak, or would you bury it for the sake of peace? Would you expose the carefully hidden rot beneath a legacy, or preserve it out of fear of what might unravel? Imagine being bound not by ropes but by memories, some not even your own, passed down like heirlooms soaked in sorrow. What would you have done? We want to know. Drop your thoughts in the comments, because your insight, your voice, helps these shadows take form and gives breath to secrets once thought forgotten. These mysteries are not just stories, they're reflections, echoes of what might be true, somewhere behind some forgotten door. And if this slow-burning tale of buried truths, veiled intentions, and the quiet persistence of a mind that sees what others miss, stirred something in you, then consider staying with us for more. Subscribe so you never miss the rustle behind the curtain, or the glint in someone's eye that doesn't quite match their smile. Share this mystery with someone who listens closely, someone who knows that the most dangerous lies are not always spoken, and that real justice often arrives not in the courtroom, but in the quiet aftermath, when no one's watching. Thank you for stepping into this hush of half-told stories and nearly missed clues until the next enigma drifts into view. Remember, trust your instincts, question the quiet, and never ignore a light left on in an empty room. Because sometimes the smallest detail, a missing button, a misplaced letter, a teacup left ever so slightly askew, can be the key to everything.